Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as part of my little 10-year anniversary celebration thing or whatever, I'm talking about the 2000 debut album from Bent, Programmed to Love. So this is going to be the start of a new tradition to replace my CD collection updates, in which I review one random album of my choice for my channel anniversary, giving me the opportunity to cover things that I wouldn't have the chance to cover in any other context. And to start this tradition off, I've decided to talk about an album which is itself celebrating a significant anniversary this year. Its 25th to be exact. Today we're talking about the British downtempo duo consisting of Simon Mills and Neil Tolliday, better known as Bent. Now, technically, I have talked about this duo before, both through my inclusion of this very album on my favorites of all time list in 2016, ranking all the way up at number 20 at the time, and also through my coverage of a comeback album they put out in 2020 called Up in the Air, which I did a Some Stuff I Miss segment on, including some very brief thoughts on their other albums. I will link the latter in the description. While Bent's catalog may consist of 5 total studio albums, and the other 4 aside from the one I'm talking about today are all perfectly enjoyable for what they are, I'd be lying if I said any of those others came anywhere near the level of quality this debut was able to hit for me, aside from some isolated moments here and there. I kind of view them to be a one-album wonder act, to whom the one project totally overshadows everything else, and the other stuff wouldn't be nearly as interesting to actually talk about in full dedicated videos. So it made a lot more sense to me to just talk about this one as a one-off. But boy is this gonna be one heck of a one-off to talk about, a project that holds a lot of very special personal meaning to me. For one thing, there is one track from this album which was one of the very first exposures I ever had to electronic music in general. I've discussed in the past how, when I was a little kid, my uncle gave me a playlist of various music recommendations burned to a CD, which also featured a couple of songs from Orbital and Air, my initial introduction to both of those bands, which obviously remain all-time favorites to this day. But also included on that CD was one track by Bent called Invisible Pedestrian, which I also unsurprisingly found to be absolutely mind-blowing upon hearing for the first time as a 12-year-old, and made me feel like I was being sent on this monumental cosmic journey. Now, at the time, Bent's music wasn't quite as easy to look further into as Orbital's or Air's was. Although I did find out about the existence of the full album that track came from and kept it in the back of my mind. I didn't get around to hearing Programmed to Love in its full entirety until, I want to say, my senior year of high school, around 2014-ish. But once I did, once again, I found it to be pretty mind-blowing, albeit in a very different way from what I expected. Invisible Pedestrian had me expecting this big, spacey, sci-fi epic kind of sound, and while that track I wouldn't say is necessarily, out of place among the track listing, in retrospect I wouldn't necessarily call it, the most indicative look of what the album was all about. The full album was primarily going for a very different kind of dreamlike downtempo sound that swapped between heart-rendingly beautiful, light and fluffy trip-hop cuts, and other cuts that had this kind of quirky, cartoonish energy to them, and some that did both at once. Adding up to this vibe that made me feel like I was being taken into a universe made out of cotton candy and chocolate and ice cream and other sweets. I'd never heard anything quite like it before, and Invisible Pedestrian didn't even turn out to be my favorite track on here. To this day, I still find it to be a pretty one-of-a-kind experience, and up there with some of my favorites of all time. Other artists have certainly come along to match its energy in years since, such as Secede or Cattell. Back when I first heard Jamie XX, I thought he was able to capture a similar kind of vibe, albeit through very different sounds. These guys have also had direct influences on certain trance artists, which I will talk about more in a bit when I go through individual tracks and stuff, but Programmed to Love remains the best project I've ever heard that tries to go for this one specific fluffy cartoon downtempo vibe, and no one's quite been able to hit this particular height in this particular way since, including the duo themselves. Again, their later albums are all good, but none of them quite hit on the same perfect balance of both more serious emotional moments and sillier and quirkier moments which really set them apart. They would either focus more on one side of that sound or the other and end up less effective or unique as a result. which isn't saying much, but still, the experience created by this album I don't think has ever been truly replicated to this well executed an extent. Now, there are some aspects to this album which maybe it's for the best that they haven't been replicated to the same extent. Most notably, the fact that the track listing for this album comes in several different variations depending on which country they were shipped out to. There's a European version of the album, a US version of the album, a UK version of the album, and a UK re-release version of the album, all of which have almost completely different track listings and sequencing. There's 23 total tracks that appear across all the different versions, and only 8 of those appear on every version, being Exercise 1, Private Road, Cylons in Love, I Remember Johnny, Swollen, Invisible Pedestrian, Irritating Noises, and Always. Yes, a lot of the remaining 15 cuts are interludes, and many of them just get subsumed into other longer tracks on certain versions. But which ones get included and which ones get cut is always completely up in the air. Things get confusing fast. And to add insult to injury, the version that I can currently see on streaming services in the US is probably the single weakest and most limited version of the album you'd be able to hear, loosely based on the original UK track listing but cut down to just 10 tracks, and only 3 of the interludes subsumed into them. Now, a different version of the album might be visible to you depending on what country you're in. I did see like a playlist somewhere that had like those auto-generated topic videos following the extended European track listing, but with all the videos marked as unavailable for me. I cannot confirm whether or not that means it's available somewhere else or just not available at all. But for the sake of this video, when going through individual tracks, I'm primarily going to focus on that European version of the track listing, which has the greatest quantity of tracks, totaling at 18, separating all the interludes into their own separate tracks instead of just tacking them onto the beginning or end of other ones. And then I'll talk about the remaining 5 tracks which appear on other versions. The 18-track European track listing is the version I'm personally most used to listening to, and in my opinion the best version of the track listing, although it's also not the version I actually own in physical form either. When I first heard the album, it was through an admittedly pirated digital download, and when I went out to purchase my CD copy here, I got sent the US version by mistake, which has this alternate album cover, and I didn't feel like contacting the seller or sending it back for a correction. For the record, even if the track listing currently on streaming services features the fewest amount of tracks across versions, pretty much anything else you wouldn't be able to find there will be easy enough to just look up on YouTube. There's lots of re-uploads of those loose tracks, both official and unofficial, and I have links to a bunch of them in the description. So let's finally talk about individual tracks on this thing. There's a ton to go through. So no matter what version of the album you pick up, the first 2 tracks will always be the same. The album first always opens with Exercise 1, which does well to perfectly set the tone of what you're getting into with this album. Starting out with warm and spacey synth pads, various spoken samples, loosely talking about, I guess, the audio recording process or something like that? I don't know. Building up a nice little floaty groove with all these little bouncing bass notes and synth chords and tapping IDM percussion to underscore everything. Later joined by these wordless one-note male vocal kinda grunts. As well as some occasional flutes and synth imitation pizzicato strings. A really lush and well-layered mix with a lot of strange stuff going on, but all adding up to this warm and welcoming dreamlike vibe, and with lead melodies catchy enough to stick in your head despite how abstract they are. But right after this, the album also makes sure to let you know that not everything is going to be that flighty and abstract. Well, mostly that flighty, but not always that abstract. There's some pop-adjacent songs here too, and the first one we get is Private Road. Notable for being one of the very first known professionally released vocal performances from singer Zoe Johnston, who would go on to become one of, if not the most frequent vocal guest for the popular trance outfit Above and Beyond. Not my personal favorite of commercial trance outfits. They're fine. They're alright. But hey, as far as singers launched by lesser-known early 2000s downtempo outfits, still better than that one really popular singer 07 launched. Anyway, Johnston's 2 appearances on this album have obviously stuck around in my mind way more than anything she'd do with Above and Beyond. her specially introverted and melancholic performance making a striking contrast with Bent's production, sort of building this slow, downbeat trip-hop cut and making it sound really expansive and beautiful through all these semi-retro feeling guitar loops, loads of airy pads and choir samples, and even some cool little dusty 50s movie soundtrack orchestral snippets thrown in every now and then. Just evokes the feeling of being out in an open meadow with a bright blue sky. The version of the album I'm used to follows this track up with a nice little interlude called Laughing Gear, which sort of acts as an outro to Private Road that kind of mirrors similar ideas through a somewhat more simplistic lens in its mix of breezy acoustic guitars, simple bass lines, and flighty synths, bookended by the whole mix getting sped up and down like a reel-to-reel tape being manipulated. Interludes such as these may not exactly have much to them. This one's just under a minute long, but I feel like they do well to add even more extra texture and flavor to the overall album experience, and all of them are a directly positive addition. Versions of the album that take these interludes out are actively worse in my opinion. I would personally argue that these interludes are almost as important to this album as the interludes on a Boards of Canada record would be. Maybe not quite that level of importance, since Boards of Canada are like specifically known for their interludes, Bent or not, but you get what I mean. They are very important to the experience in my eyes. It's musical world building. Anyway, as much as I love tracks like Exercise 1 and Private Road, even cuts like these can somewhat pale in comparison to the next cut, I Love My Man. One of my absolute favorites on the whole album. Top 3 or 4, easy. There may not be a ton to say about this track, but goddamn is this an amazing tune. Built primarily around an old sample of Greek singer Nana Mouskouri from the 60s. It just really leans into all these sweet retro nostalgic tones, loads of expansively layered dusty string and choir samples washing around a sort of bubbly and bouncy percussion loop that sounds mildly bossa nova inspired, just really capturing this sort of whimsicality and innocence with a melody that sticks in your head like few others even on this album. It's like the musical equivalent of like eating a really good ice cream sandwich or something. And I guess one could say the theme of sweets also continues over to the following Butterfingers interlude. I may not be a fan of that particular candy, but this track is really nice. A more ambient moment for the album with more swirling retro movie soundtrack samples and pretty chimes going up next to moodier keyboard tones. Next up we got the next major track, Cylons in Love. This may not technically be one of my favorites, as the melodic hook isn't really the strongest, but I think it says something about the standards we're running on here when this technically is not one of my favorites. The mix of warm and comforting acoustic guitars, floaty keyboard licks, a thick and banging hip-hop breakbeat, and of course lots of laid-back vocoder vocals that all do well to live up to the vibe promised by the title of evoking the evil robots from Battlestar Galactica falling in love. I've never actually watched Battlestar Galactica, so whatever. And it's also followed by the Wrong Rock interlude, which is like this quick little snippet of like rockabilly guitar loops that seem to sort of mildly evoke Wild West imagery or something. Odd turn, but again, I kind of like the weird, unexpected flavor it adds. And then we get A Ribbon for My Hair, which, may as well say it, this is my favorite track on the album, and the one I've listened to the most frequently, without question, even with the several years head start Invisible Pedestrian had. The conceit of this track on paper is almost exactly the same as I Love My Man, right down to also being based almost entirely around a Nana Mouskouri sample from the exact same record, no less, if I'm not mistaken. But the effect this track gives off is completely different, where I Love My Man showed a picture of like, I guess, a woman just completely in love and happy to be in the current relationship she's in even when times aren't as good. A Ribbon for My Hair is about a relationship where the two aren't communicating properly and the woman feels misunderstood and not listened to because the guy is buying all this expensive jewelry and all she wants is a ribbon for her hair. Yeah, that sounds like an old mid-60s ballad, alright. Very old-school, traditional gender roles type stuff, even if I do appreciate the part about not needing riches to be happy. But the lyrics of this album, just in general, really don't matter. The important thing is the mix Bent provide to back it up that make it feel positively heartbreaking. There's so many layers of warm string sections, harps, various echoing female vocal samples for even more nostalgic atmosphere to go over its simple but satisfying hip-hop beats and bass lines, and the mix is so subtly but imposingly huge sounding and impressive, while also warm and comforting, hitting on like that one specific forlorn emotional note so well. Again, I kind of don't even know if I can put it into words. Just one of those tracks that I feel like the sound of it is able to purely speak for itself. Feels like I'm literally being taken into heaven or something. The fact that this track and I Love My Man aren't even included on several versions of the album, including the version currently on streaming in the US, is a damn crime. Maybe there's some weird sample licensing thing going on there, I don't know. But if you are gonna listen to this album, you really have to seek out a version that has those two cuts on it. They are easily among the most essential. Moving on from there, we got a quick 10-second interlude called Blue, which is like a snippet of some guy extolling the virtues of the color blue by singing it in a bunch of different excited voice. Sounds pulled out of like some kind of Sesame Street segment that's teaching kids about colors or something. Blue, blue is beautiful blue. Low-key kind of have a soft spot for that one. When my uncle first gave me that playlist with Invisible Pedestrian on it, the version he gave me had the blue snippet tacked on at the end, so there's a bit of extra nostalgia there. But anyway, this segues perfectly into the next major track, I Remember Johnny. Another one of the more up-tempo cuts on display here that kind of combines some different ideas heard elsewhere in the album, but presents them in a very different way. There's more vocoder vocals here, like on Cylons in Love, and the ending part has yet another Nanamo scory sample, albeit obviously not basing the entire track around it this time. Although the general vibe of this track is a lot more playful and carefree, it's mostly based around some simple and kinda quirky piano loops, do-do-do-do-do, going over some breezy foot-tapping trip-hop beats. There's like a bunch of cut-up loops of some crowd cheering and a dude making some weird noise. And a sampled trumpet solo, too. It's a track that sounds silly at first, but gets more comforting and spacier as it gets along. Another pretty major highlight here, and one of the most unique and memorable cuts on display. But that track is followed by the much more straightforward Swollen. This is the other track that features Zoe Johnston's vocals, and I'm not sure which of the two I prefer. This one's a bit more energetic than Private Road, moves at roughly the same tempo as I Remember Johnny, and Johnston's vocal performance isn't quite as introverted. Also always found that one lyric about floating just like a cloud to be maybe a tiny smidge on the nose for the tone this entire album is going for. But as per usual, the core tune and the production really carry it into great territory anyway. It actually feels darker and more minor key in its particular choice of chord progressions. Got some more old school string samples which have this really dramatic flourish to them, going up next to really thick buzzing bass lines and various delicate piano lines. Also the track kind of having a little section at the very end that just lets the breakbeats loop ad nauseum without the tune for a while before breaking the whole mix down into all these bubbling, amelodic experimental effects. Pretty sick. I also like how on my version it segues directly into another interlude called B Bishop, which almost has like a dubby IDM adjacent flavor with these echoing bass lines pulsating over a chilling and spacey pad with fuzzy effects and a few occasional percussion textures that sort of sound like tapping ball bearings together a la Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen. And that track also passes its baton directly to the following Exercise 2. On some versions of the album, Exercise 2 is actually like the bonus hidden track at the end, and acting as like a sort of credits roll moment for the whole album, and like a bookend mirror to Exercise 1, which, even without having heard it in that context, I can see exactly how it would make sense to put it there. Even melodically fits for a credits roll type moment. Though I'm still more accustomed to its placement closer to the middle, and I'd prefer to keep that like double segue leading up to it. Anyway, Exercise 2 is fun. The tune does not resemble Exercise 1 in any way, but it's also kind of a fun, more abstract moment for the album that seems to mostly base itself around what sounds like the sound of tape rewinding being pitched up and down to form a tune, going up next to thick live bass lines, filtered effects bouncing between the left and right ears, various light and breezy synth lines, and even some snippets of violin as well. You could say this track really has wonderful sound and strange shape, huh? Don't know how many people are going to get that reference in this language, but whatever. Then after all these various elements just seem to fall apart and collapse into off-key heaps at the end, we move into the track that first made me a Bent fan, Invisible Pedestrian. It may not be my number one favorite on the album, what with A Ribbon for My Hair, I Love My Man, and the functional album closer I'll get to also being here. But obviously, this cut is always going to mean something special to me from how early on I came across it. And quite frankly, it has the same appeal to me now that it did when I was 12. What's kind of fun about this track is that it starts out so unassuming. The opening 17 seconds is absolutely nothing but some light bass guitar. Just a little bit of bass guitar. Boom, 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 boom. It sounds like nothing until suddenly the most massive fucking breakbeat comes crashing down on top of it with all these swirling, filtered wind sound effects. And then these big, spacey, melodic pads come in to envelop everything, and even before the other brighter, laser-like synth leads come in to harmonize with the pads, or before they start bringing in all these semi-ridiculous opera-singing samples, just to make everything even more extra for the hell of it. Alrighty, this has instantly become one of my favorite songs of all time, first time I heard it. I mean, when I was a kid, any kind of pads that get filtered just that sounded like the future to me, and it was just the coolest shit ever. At that point, I already loved the Gary Newman song Cars, and I thought this was that song on steroids. Note, this track does not actually sound similar to Cars, but I guess the effect is sorta in the same general ballpark if you squint at it, maybe? I don't know. But in any case, that song absolutely kicks ass. Once again, not exactly the closest match for the dreamy tones of the rest of the album, but not a track this album could ever do without. Moving on from there, we get probably my favorite of the random interludes, Memories. Just a little bit of old, tender doo-wop vocal harmonizing going up next to some old string samples, and a heck of a lot of reverb to really highlight those old nostalgic feelings. What happened to my voice? And then we move on to Irritating Noises, which is a bit of an odd moment for this album. I think this might be their attempt at incorporating a mild influence from country music of all things, with all these acoustic guitars strumming and occasional slide guitar licks in the background, joining its slightly thumping new disco-y beat, as well as an actual male vocalist to join its vocoder vocals. It's certainly a catchy track, though not one that always moved me that much, mainly because I was never super crazy about the male vocalist, credited as someone called Johnny Flash, who I strongly suspect is just one of the bent guys themselves doing a mediocre Johnny Cash impression. I never skip this one in context of the album, I just never seek it out to listen to individually. I guess if you absolutely force me to pick a least favorite cut on this version of the album, I'd probably go with that one, even though I still think it's pretty good at worst. I don't love the singer, but he's fine. He's not bad. But that finally takes us to the album's ending, and no matter which version you pick up, the functional closer remains the same. The track, Always. This track just feels perfectly made to fit into that spot to be the last emotional resolution of the journey this whole project took you on. And even if it wasn't placed in that specific spot, it would still be one of the very best tracks on the album, summing up the core appeal of pretty much everything the duo was about. Again, starts pretty unassuming with all these loops of some kind of loose vibraphone sounds, building up some thicker pads until finally building up into a slick, nostalgic new disco jam with super tight bass lines, and of course a super catchy female vocal sample, this time pulled out of a 60s Latin standard track from Nori Paramore and his orchestra called Always in My Heart. The tune is just immaculate. The mix of sounds that swirl around it feel so lively and organic and full of joy. Again, don't really have much else to say besides it's probably the duo's single biggest bop. Oh yeah, and shout out to the trance artist Chicane, who once made a cover version of this track called You Are Always from his Somersault album, which is pretty awesome and worth seeking out separately. For the record, that album could have been on my list of the other day of albums overshadowed by one great song. You do not need to hear anything else from that project, but still pretty dang cool that that cover exists. Anyway, there's one last track on the version I'm used to called Beach Buggy. Technically sort of an interlude, though it's the closest an interlude just comes to being a regular track at a little under 3 minutes. Also, for a glorified outro, it is a nice little bundle of well-textured joy itself. bringing in all these twinkling synth keyboards, bright xylophones, warm guitar loops and breakbeats and ambient pads and even trumpet solos that all do well to add up to that beachy sort of vibe. I can see why it's marked as an interlude, if only because it does very much feel like an afterthought in context, but it's an interlude with enough to like for me to put among some of my regular favorites. So that's everything on the European version of Program to Love, although there's still 5 more tracks that only show up on other versions of the album. In fact, the version that's currently on streaming in the US has 3 tracks which do not appear on the version I'm used to, 2 major tracks and 1 interlude. The first major track to talk about is called Chocolate Wings. This was originally the B-side for when Irritating Noises was first released as a one-off single under the name Johnny Flash and the Flames. And it definitely sounds like the B-side to Irritating Noises' A-side. It's another merely okay Johnny Cash impression going over more of their standard dream pop sample mashups. And this track is just decent. I've never gotten into it on nearly the same level as most of these others. I generally like the instrumental, and the melody and tune is predictably solid, but that slightly meh feeling I got from hearing the male vocals on Irritating Noises got turned up into an actually irritating level on this track, where whoever was doing the vocals decided to do this whole spoken word thing for the verses, and then almost start to border a little on Elvis-y territory for the chorus. I need my chocolate wings. And lyrically, I think they're trying to make some kind of, like, sexual innuendo, but I'm not actually sure what chocolate wings flying up to your stars is supposed to specifically mean, and I don't really think I want to know the answer to that question either. I know Swollen was probably low-key about sex as well, but at least there Zoe Johnston played it dead serious and made it feel like something more poetic and meaningful. This one's delivered like they're nudging you, like in that one Monty Python sketch. Hey, I need my chocolate wings. Know what I mean? Know what I mean? Say no more, say no more. Yeah, I can't take this one seriously, and not in the good way this time. The tune is still good enough to keep it perfectly listenable in spite of all that, but out of the 23 tracks that appear through all the various versions of this album, that is definitely my least favorite. Speaking of innuendo, the other major track on US streaming that I haven't mentioned is called Welly Top Mary, also known as Welly Top Mary according to said streaming services, and I cannot tell whether that's a typo or self-censorship. If you, like me, did not know what Welly Top meant before seeing it on this track listing, you don't need to look it up. But thankfully the actual track is really good, and doesn't have any lyrics, suggestive or otherwise. This one's built around all these spacey, filtered 80s pop-sounding samples, which have a bit of a proto-vaporwave feel to them, and all these wiry, buzzing leads to go on top, which you'd think would be a lot more annoying than they are, but they somehow work pretty well. Definitely one of those tracks that sees them leaning into the quirkier side to their sound, but there is a unique feel to this one that I don't get out of the other tracks on the album, so I will take it. And the last remaining interlude that you can hear on US streaming, tacked onto the end always, is called Toothless Gibbon, which, boy, is this a chaotic inclusion, featuring all these monkey sound effects, going over a bunch of off-kilter horn samples and various synth arpeggios, going over thicker breaks that build up and just keep getting denser and louder and more overloaded before abruptly fading out at the end. It's quite the what the fuck moment to close certain versions of the album out, but I absolutely have to respect it for that. Inexplicable weird shit like that is kind of a small part of Ben's appeal for me, and while I personally prefer Beach Buggy as the outro, mostly for nostalgia reasons, this works equally as well in its own very different way. But that's still not quite all the tracks to talk about. On the US CD version I own physically here, there's also one track which only appears on this version and none of the others, called A New Wig for Me. This one is technically on streaming since it appeared on one of their early EPs. But yeah, this track is kind of like a breezy and more up-tempo house-adjacent tune with all these brisker and bouncier breakbeats underscoring all these airy and cloudy pads and repetitive sample chops and occasional xylophones and chimes and trumpet licks. Out of the 5 tracks that aren't on the European version, that's probably my personal favorite. And the very last track to mention is called Private School Investigations. This track only appears on the original UK CD version. It's one of those unlisted hidden tracks, after both Always and Toothless Gibbon acting as the closer, which ordinarily I would expect to be really annoying, especially given, according to Discogs, that CD version lists the track in question as being over 18 minutes. So I would expect, like, a really long silence and some quick little fragment at the end. But actually, Bent were nice enough to make that hidden track last over 9.5 minutes. And by totaling up all the track lengths, I can surmise that means the silence in between them on the CD couldn't have been much longer than like 15 seconds. Which is refreshingly short as far as pauses on CDs with this gimmick go. You don't even really need to sit up and hit fast forward for that, that's very kind of them. Now, Private School Investigations isn't necessarily one of my biggest favorites out of all the tracks on here. A big segment of the track in the middle focuses on these lengthy samples of some kids singing the extended version of the London Bridge nursery rhyme, which I've never really felt that much, and perhaps, unfortunately, that is the only real memorable hook the track has. But the main groove underscoring the whole track is really solid, kind of a more dub-influenced instrumental hip-hop kind of thing that gives me a bit of, like, a Nightmares on Wax or Sounds from the Ground vibes in moments. There's loads of well-layered synth blends that sound quite expansive, and the track melts into a more down-tempo ambient mode in much of its second half to last third, which is all very nice. And as with most things that take this kind of influence from dub, the bass lines are all satisfying as hell. There's even a little mild bass soloing at the end, which is a nice touch. I may not absolutely love the track or consider it a favorite, but it does make good use of those near 10 minutes and makes them feel not nearly as long as they really are, so I will take it anyway. Another really good track regardless. So that is finally every track that appears on Bent's Program to Love. Yeah, that's a lot, and I wouldn't have it any other way. This album has so much nostalgia bias and has kind of become part of my DNA at this point. But I think it's fair to say I think this is some of the best down-tempo music, like, ever made, maybe. It's so vivid and imaginative and creative while also completely nailing its biggest emotional moments and with tons of hooks and melodies that'll stick in your head for ages in the best possible way. And every single track is a winner, aside from maybe Chocolate Wings, which is still not that bad. Even the interludes, I think, all add something of substance and make the album feel that much more imaginative and multidimensional through all the strange little flavors and textures they each bring to the table. I do not believe there are any skips out of all 23 tracks you can get here. Yes, even the 10-second snippet of the guy going, "Blue, blue is beautiful blue." If there were ever like a deluxe reissue for this album that included every single track in the same package, well, there is a chance that could be a bit much for one listening experience. That's over 100 minutes of music, but still, I could recommend that anyway in a heartbeat. That's what's been on my iPod for the past several years. As for how to score this album, well, that's going to be tricky, because the different versions of this album and their different choices in sequencing do directly affect how I enjoy the album, and not in equal measures. In other words, I have different scores for the different versions of the album. The worst version of the album is the version I see on streaming services in the US right now, which I will have to actually link in the description. Not only are most of the interludes cut out, but there's no I Love My Man or A Ribbon for My Hair or even Exercise 2. Instead, you get Chocolate Wings and Welly Top Mary, which I do like the latter a lot, but it's nowhere near A Ribbon for My Hair level. But still, even the most bare-bones possible version of this album still gives you plenty of phenomenal tracks, like Exercise 1, Private Road, I Remember Johnny, Swollen, Invisible, Pedestrian, and Always. There's enough of my biggest favorites and nostalgia points there for that version to get away with a strong 8.5 to a light 8.7 out of 10. You would be missing some essential pieces, but it would still work. A bit of a step up would be the original UK version of the CD, which the current streaming version is based on. That version makes sure to keep in a whole bunch of the interludes, which is key, and that's the only version with Private School Investigations, too. This isn't the absolute best version of the album you could go for, still no I Love My Man or A Ribbon for My Hair, but it does fully retain the level of wilder imagination and sense of expansive creative depth that I came to love so much about it, so that is a serviceably full enough picture of what I personally came to love in the album to just bump up to a light solid 9 out of 10. Next step up from there is the USCD version I have here. This version also cuts out nearly all the interludes, which is not ideal, but it's the only version that has not just I Love My Man and a ribbon for my hair, but also Welly Top Mary and a new wig for me, all together in the same place. So even if this version feels a slight bit more, I guess, marginally compilation-y to me, and less like it's setting up the kind of wild musical gumdrops and lollipops universe that a version with the interludes would be able to deliver, the sheer amount of incredible standouts you'd get could bump that version up to like a 9.3. The UK re-release version that ends in Exercise 2 looks like it might be even closer. Still could use more interludes from what I can see, but again, more than enough standouts where it looks like it would hit on about the same level as the USCD version. But obviously there's a reason I primarily based this video around the European track listing. That was the exact version I had in mind when I put this album on my favorites of all time list in 2016 and ranked it all the way up at number 20. Sure, there's no Welly Top Mary, A New Wig for Me, or Toothless Gibbon on that version. Those are all great tracks, and depending on your taste, some of those could be preferable to other moments that did make the cut for this version. Also, of course, I cannot deny my bias towards this version just being the one I've been the most used to listening ever since hearing it for the first time in full in my, early college days. But I do think that version is the definitive track listing for the album. The one that best exemplifies everything that made me fall in love with it, both from the imagination side and the emotional side. That version's the real all-time favorite, and the album which became one of my very favorite downtempo albums of all time, behind only the likes of stuff like Air's Moon Safari, among others. That is the version which will be always in my heart, and the one that I'm going to score a 9.5 out of 10. Sorry if it turns out to be a pain in the ass to actually get to that version. Confusing shit like this is a big part of why I've never remotely had the album in consideration for a 10, but whatever. No matter which version you get, they're obviously all great, and I can wholeheartedly recommend them regardless. So yeah, that's going to be my review of Bent's Program to Love. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.